There are moments in history when the sky feels heavy, not with weather, but with something far older, far more foreboding. Imagine a small medieval town clustered around a looming stone castle, its narrow streets winding like arteries through a heart that beats slower each day. The air is thick with unease. No one speaks of war outright, but everyone feels it. The blacksmith hammers slower. The baker glances twice at travelers. Even the children play quieter games, ears attuned to the whispers of their parents. A siege is not declared, like a festival it creeps, a shadow that lengthens day by day, until one morning the gates are closed with no announcement, and the world outside is officially a threat. In these uneasy days, rumors carry more weight than facts. A merchant arriving from the east speaks of soldiers on the road, mercenaries, with no banner but full purses. Another claims the king's men have abandoned the river pass. The most trusted word comes from silence. The tax collector hasn't returned. When the lord of the castle gathers his men atop the parapets, those below know the unspoken truth. He looks not toward the village, but outward toward the hills, where watchfires have started to burn through the nights. The villagers understand without being told something is coming, and they are not prepared. The first formal act of defense is quiet but final. The portcullis lowers before dawn one morning, sealing the town within the walls. The drawbridge groans as it's pulled in, chains clanking with a sound that echoes through every household. Those who lingered outside, farmers, herders, foragers, have either found their way in or have been left behind. A woman sobs at the gate, clutching a child whose father never returned from the forest. A shepherd stands with a lamb slung over his shoulder, waiting for a signal that never comes. Inside, the people gather at windows and doorways, their breath fogging the glass as they stare into the gray morning. No one knows how long they'll be here, or what the enemy truly wants, only that they are no longer free to leave. Within the castle walls, life begins to shift. The granary is inventoried, the well is tested, guards are doubled, then tripled. The castle steward, usually a man concerned with records and receipts, now walks with the captain of the guard, whispering in his ear. Every household is ordered to contribute what it can. Salted meats, sacks of barley, bundles of firewood, even tallow candles become precious. A sort of martial domesticity descends, one not of violence, but of preparation. In kitchens, the bread is stretched thinner. In stables, horses are examined not for trade, but for endurance. Mothers teach children to stay away from windows. Fathers sharpen tools that might soon become weapons. But not all is grim. In the strange way that crises bond communities, a sense of shared purpose begins to blossom. The baker gives loaves freely to those with nothing. A retired soldier shows children how to sling stones. Songs are sung in taverns, not to forget the coming storm, but to meet it with defiance. The priest speaks of Job and Jonah, of trials and deliverance. We have been tested before, he says, though no one remembers when. And though the air is tense, it is also thick with something stronger, resolve, perhaps, or at least the refusal to surrender to fear before it is earned. The castle itself, long a symbol of distant authority, now becomes a refuge. The inner bailey fills with those too poor to afford stone homes. Families pitch tents, build lean-tos against the outer walls. Chickens cluck in corners, dogs howl through the night. The scent of wood smoke and sweat mingles with the lavender hung in windows to keep spirits pure. life doesn't stop. It contracts, folds inward, like the petals of a flower before a storm. Beneath banners and battlements, the rhythms of daily existence, meals, sleep, prayer, carry on. It is a siege in all but name. Children, resilient and unburdened by fear's full weight, adapt fastest. They play games using rocks and discarded helmets. They reenact battles with sticks and loud, dramatic deaths. One morning, a group of them is caught trying to sneak through the sally port to find the enemy and spy on them. They are punished gently. Their spirit is not unlike that of the adults. They, too, want to understand the shape of this invisible danger pressing in on their world. Every rumor becomes a story. Every shadow on the hillside becomes a banner. The unknown is fertile ground for both terror and imagination, and the enemy still unseen makes their presence known, not with arrows or fire, but with absence. Traitors stop arriving. No birds fly from the direction of the eastern woods. The road is dustless, undisturbed. Watchmen report hearing distant horns at night and the occasional flicker of torchlight. A cow is found slain outside the walls, its body untouched but for its throat. The message is clear. We are near. We are watching. You are surrounded. The people whisper of warlocks, of giants, of barbarian hordes from forgotten lands. It doesn't matter what the truth is. What matters is that no one can sleep without dreaming of attack. Then comes the morning when the first arrow lands in the courtyard. It strikes not a man, but a post, embedded deep in the wood, as if placed by a careful hand. Tied to its shaft is a length of cloth, white, blood-spattered, and marked with a crude symbol. No one recognizes it. The archers on the walls see nothing. The gate is locked, but the message is received. This is no longer preparation. This is siege. The storm has broken. The only question that remains is how long the walls and the people within can endure. Before the gates were sealed and the air turned to dread, the village below the castle thrived in its own quiet rhythm. Life, though hard, was ordered, defined by the ringing of bells, the toll of hours, and the steady march of seasons. Dawn brought the thud of wooden clogs on cobbled streets, the splash of water drawn from wells, the grumble of pigs in the lanes. Bakers stoked fires, while millers checked the grindstones. Children chased geese, women hung laundry, and old men smoked pipes outside alehouses. No one would call it a golden age, but it was a life understood one, whose discomforts were familiar and whose joys, though small, were cherished. The castle itself loomed over all this like a silent god, stone-faced, austere, ancient. Its towers caught the first sunlight and the last. Most villagers had never been inside its inner walls, save for festival days or in times of judgment. It housed the Lord, his family, his soldiers, and a quiet bureaucracy that few paid mind to. Yet the castle was never irrelevant. It was protection, heritage, and the source of order. Its very shadow marked the boundaries of their world. To live within its reach was to live under the watchful eye of power, for better or worse. Life revolved around labor. Most villagers worked the fields, plowing in spring, harvesting in autumn, and storing grain in winter. Others kept livestock, maintained the forges, or sold fish and onions in the square. Even children had roles, collecting firewood, tending younger siblings, or running errands with bread tucked under arms. The rhythms of toil were relentless, but also grounding. The Sabbath offered brief respite, a chance to don better clothes, attend Mass, and hear news. Markets bustled on fair days. Drummers marched through the streets to announce new laws or upcoming levies. People grumbled, but they adapted, as they always had. And then, slowly, things began to shift. The first signs were subtle. A patrol failed to return from the woods, and another was dispatched with twice the number. The Lord, usually a remote figure, began appearing at the edge of the village square more frequently, always speaking quietly with his reeve. Monks from a distant abbey passed through and did not linger. By midsummer, the roads were less crowded, and travelers came with guarded eyes and tight purses. There were fewer peddlers and fewer songs in the taverns. People began to stockpile salt and flour without admitting why. Superstition filled the silence left by facts. An old woman claimed the river's frogs were croaking differently, a sign of war, she said. A boy saw a red fox bolt through the churchyard and was slapped for speaking of it. A shepherd found a tree split by lightning and whispered it was a curse. In times of peace, these tales would have been laughed off. Now they clung to the air like mist. Even the priest, normally quick to dismiss such fears, began to preach more heavily on wrath, on repentance, and on the trials of Job. People began to pray longer, kneel harder, confess deeper. As tensions thickened, the village's social order tightened. The town watch began enforcing curfew with more severity. Blacksmiths were ordered to shift their efforts from horseshoes to spearheads. A tally of livestock was made then remade by the castle steward, who now walked the streets with a satchel of parchment and a guarded expression. The alehouse, once a place of refuge and rowdy laughter, became subdued. Laughter still came, but it was brittle. Talk turned to the value of walls, of food, of what each household had hidden away in cellars. Trust began to fray at the edges. Children felt it too, though they couldn't name it. The games became more violent. One boy fashioned a crude wooden sword and dubbed himself the Castle Breaker. His sister threw clumps of dirt at him, shouting, "Invader, invader." Parents frowned, but didn't intervene. Perhaps they hoped the play would prepare them somehow, or perhaps they were simply too exhausted to care. In times of fear, the innocence of youth becomes both a comfort and a warning, a mirror held up to a future no one wants to face. As harvest approached, the world beyond the village grew quieter. No more carts came from the western bridge. The merchant's house stood shuttered. A messenger galloped in one dusk and left before dawn, face pale, eyes red. Still, no proclamation was made. The Lord held council with his captains, and the rest were left to guess. But the signs were there: more arrows being fletched, more flour taken in tithe, more soldiers drilling in the outer courtyard. The castle no longer watched in silence. It moved, it prepared, it remembered its ancient purpose. And so the village lived its last days of freedom under the long shadow of what was to come. There was no final feast, no goodbye, just an eerie stillness, like the breath held before a scream. On the eve of the siege, a strange peace settled over the land. Crickets chirped in the hedgerows. The river murmured, as it always had, and yet even the stars seemed to blink with apprehension. 1,000 ordinary things happened. That day bread was baked, babies cried, a dog barked at the wind. But under it all pulsed a single truth: the world was about to change, and the people, knowingly or not, had already begun to retreat into the safety of stone. The day the gates were locked did not begin with trumpet blasts or banners in the sky. It began, as most days did, with the rising sun, bathing the castle's gray stones in soft amber light. Roosters crowed. Fires were lit. The smell of baking bread drifted from the village ovens. But there was a difference, subtle yet undeniable. The watchmen on the walls were already doubled before dawn. The outermost gatehouse, where merchants usually passed with goods and gossip, stood silent. No carts arrived. No tinkers sang. The world beyond the walls had gone mute. And then, without fanfare, the castle's drawbridge was pulled in. The chains creaked like old bones. The counterweights groaned. With a deep, final clatter, the great timber span rose into the air, sealing off the entrance across the moat. Inside the courtyard, villagers stood frozen. A few had come to plead entry for relatives who lingered in outlying farms. Others had hoped, foolishly, that they might still venture beyond the walls, just one more trip to gather herbs or to check traps set in the woods. The portcullis slammed down with a weighty clang that silenced even the most stubborn hopes. The siege hadn't begun with swords or fire. It began with the simple act of sealing the last door. For many, this moment marked the true turning point. Fear became real, no longer abstract. It settled into bellies, into bone. A silence stretched across the square, only broken by a child's confused wail and the distant bray of a donkey. The lord of the castle appeared at the high balcony overlooking the courtyard, flanked by his 2 sons in chainmail. He spoke not of fear, but of duty, not of war, but of endurance. "We are the shield," he declared, "and we will not break." His voice was strong, but even those who believed him felt its tremble beneath the surface. Faith was armor, but armor could crack. The days that followed were unlike any before. Every household was ordered to inventory its stores: flour, salted pork, dried peas, onions, apples, cheese, all measured and recorded. A team of scribes moved through the village with wax tablets and ledgers, noting quantities, estimating consumption. Those with excess were compelled to contribute. Those with little were issued rations. A temporary sense of equality emerged not through kindness, but necessity. Hunger, after all, does not respect status. Even the wealthier merchants found themselves standing in queues, bowls in hand, waiting like everyone else. Movement was restricted. No one was allowed on the walls, safeguards and lookouts. Torches were doused early at night. The castle's inner well was guarded. Anyone caught hoarding or stealing food faced harsh punishment, public shaming, or worse. Yet, despite the tightening grip of rules and routines, life adapted. Cooks found ways to stretch meals. Women gathered herbs from the moat's edge. Children made a game of collecting firewood chips left behind by the blacksmiths. It was not comfort, but it was continuity. And in times of siege, continuity could mean survival. The outer defenses, once half forgotten, were reinforced with desperate vigor. Barricades were raised inside the gatehouse. Boiling cauldrons were hung on iron brackets above the walls to be filled with water, oil, or pitch. Arrow slits were cleared of rubble and manned day and night. In the towers, heavy stones were stacked, ready to be dropped. Even old and wounded men were put to use, sharpening stakes, carrying supplies, sewing sacks. Those who had fought in younger years taught those who had not. War stories, once told in jest, now became lessons. Fear began to wear a different face. It no longer screamed. It whispered. It lived in glances, in silences between sentences. People walked with their heads lower. Arguments that once would have erupted in the marketplace now fizzled into mutters. The tavern remained open, but the laughter was quieter, the songs slower. Priests held more frequent masses, urging repentance and resilience. At night, prayers echoed through stone chapels and wooden homes alike. Mothers crossed themselves over sleeping children. Even those who rarely bowed to saints now lit candles and whispered names of the divine. Yet not all within the walls shared a single mind. There were those who questioned the Lord's strategy, who muttered that the gates should not have been closed so soon. A few argued for open negotiation with the enemy, though none dared name who that enemy was. Others, haunted by dreams or old wounds, claimed to have seen things from the wall's strange shapes, unnatural fires, men moving without sound. In the absence of clear truth, suspicion began to coil through the population. Not enough to rupture unity, but enough to keep trust on a short leash. On the third night, the first horn was heard. It sounded from the distant hills, long, low, and mournful. A single note, held for what felt like an eternity, then silence. The guards on the parapets stiffened. Archers notched arrows and scanned the tree line, but nothing followed. No movement, no reply, just the soft night wind and the distant call of an owl. Still, that sound settled into every heart like a worm in wood. The enemy was near. The siege had not yet truly begun, but it had announced itself. The castle held, for now. But the air had changed. The gates were locked, and beyond them, something waited. At first, the siege felt more like a pause than a crisis. No arrows flew, no siege towers rolled forth, no war drums shook the ground. Instead, it was the stillness that unsettled. The quiet outside the walls pressed in like fog, dense and unnatural. Villagers gathered at the battlements, hoping for a glimpse of the enemy, but saw only the treetops swaying gently, and perhaps a flicker of torchlight far off among the branches. It was not what they expected. They had prepared for noise, for violence, for chaos. What they received was silence, and in that silence, their imaginations bloomed like mold in a damp cellar. Inside the walls, the air was different, toothic, sour, stale. With the gates closed and fires lit, smoke clung low in the courtyards and alleys. The scent of boiled onions, tallow, and unwashed bodies mingled with the smell of sweat and fear. The villagers, now pressed shoulder to shoulder with castle servants, soldiers, merchants, and refugees from nearby hamlets, began to feel the squeeze of confinement. Space grew scarce, tempers grew short. Where once a man had a yard for his goats, or a stretch of bench to nap, now he shared his breath with strangers. The noble family remained largely unseen, holed up in the inner keep, their banners still fluttering high from the towers. Occasionally, the steward or captain of the guard emerged to relay orders, distribute rations, or quell disputes. But for most, the power in the castle was now the soldiers. They walked the streets with sharper eyes, their boots loud against the cobbles. They kept watch from the walls, rotated in shifts that blurred night from day. Yet even they could not offer reassurance. Their hands trembled on their sword hilts. They, too, were waiting for the first strike. Some villagers tried to continue their routines. The baker set up ovens inside the outer stables, trying to stretch dwindling flour into coarse rounds of bread. A washerwoman boiled linens in the shadow of the chapel, humming to herself to drown out the silence. Children were tasked with fetching water, watching fires, helping mothers prepare meager meals. But every task was tinged with anxiety. Each drawn bucket of water was precious. Each split log of firewood was carefully measured. There would be no resupply. Everything consumed brought them one step closer to the unknown edge. At night, the tension deepened. The castle grew darker. Earlier torches rationed, candles reserved for the sick or elderly. Families huddled close under thin blankets. Some tried to keep spirits high with stories or songs, but most stared quietly into the darkness, ears straining for any sign of the enemy. And there were signs, though vague, the low murmur of movement beyond the walls, the occasional sound of metal striking stone in the distance. Once, a dog howled from the gatehouse and then went silent. People began to dream strange dreams of fire, of walls crumbling, of whispers in dead languages. The first formal casualty of the siege was not a man, but an ox, a beast of burden, starved and maddened, kicked through its pen in the lower courtyard and trampled a boy fetching kindling. The child died before morning. A priest said prayers over the body, but even he could not disguise the unease in his voice. It was an omen, many said. The walls had not been breached, but already death had entered. And so began the tallying, not just of food or water, but of loss. Quietly, privately, people began to count. How many days left? How many meals? How many graves? Rumors began to shift, as they always do. Some claimed to have seen enemy scouts in the woods. Others swore they heard drums at midnight. A woman in the northern tower said she watched a man with a horn standing among the trees, unmoving for hours. But the enemy did not attack. Instead, they watched, waited, and the villagers, confined within their walls, found themselves prisoners of their own dread. There was no enemy to fight, only a shadow outside the gates and a silence that grew heavier by the hour. And so the first days passed not with fire and fury, but with slow suffocation, the kind that gnaws rather than strikes, the kind that makes every cough sound like doom and every creak of wood feel like warning. A siege, it turns out, is not merely a test of strength. It is a test of nerves, of patience, of unity. And as the sun set on the fourth day, painting the sky with sickly orange and gray, the people within the castle realized something profound. They were not waiting for the enemy to break down the gates. They were waiting to see if they would break themselves. The first true sign that the siege had begun in earnest wasn't an arrow or a catapult stone. It was the taste of watered-down broth, thin, gray, and unseasoned. It arrived in wooden bowls, passed out in silence near the castle's granary. The meat was gone. The bread, once hearty and coarse, had grown smaller with each passing day. Even salt, long taken for granted, was no longer freely sprinkled, but weighed and tracked like coin. Rationing had officially begun, and with it came a new kind of dread, one that seeped not from the enemy beyond the walls, but from the bellies within them. The steward of the castle, a man previously known for his dull speeches and love of fine parchment, now found himself both feared and resented. With a ledger always at his side, he moved from house to house like a judge, accompanied by 2 armed guards. He counted everything: barley sacks, smoked fish, dried herbs, even rats caught in the storage pits. Any surplus was seized and redistributed. Few protested openly, but many hid what they could. Secret caches of flour or jerky were hidden beneath floorboards or behind loose stones. A pot of honey became a treasure, a single apple a luxury. The central kitchens, once the heart of castle life, were now places of slow desperation. Cooks stretched ingredients with weeds, boiled bones until they crumbled, and soaked hard biscuits in weak ale to soften them for the old and the sick. Children were fed first, then the elderly, then everyone else in strict order of importance. The Lord's table was no exception, though he still dined behind closed doors. Word spread that even his meat had disappeared, and that his wife had taken to chewing cloves to quell her hunger. In famine, even rank bends to reality. With hunger came tension. Fights broke out in the breadlines, small scuffles at first, then full-blown brawls. One morning, a man was caught stealing dried peas from a neighbor's windowsill. He was dragged into the square and publicly beaten, not just for punishment, but as a warning. Afterward, people watched one another with sharper eyes. Friends became suspicious. Neighbors guarded their doors with newfound suspicion. The enemy outside the walls remained unseen, but inside, desperation began to show its teeth. To cope, new roles emerged. Children were made into foragers, scouring the courtyards for anything: edible nettles, dandelion roots, the occasional beetle. Mothers taught them how to chew pine bark, how to boil moss into a bitter tea that could dull a growling stomach. Men who once worked fields now stood watch over dwindling stockpiles of firewood and oats. Even the priests adjusted their sermons, speaking not of plenty and salvation, but of endurance and sacrifice. Christ hungered in the desert, they reminded, and so shall we in faith. Still, not all hope was gone. Small kindnesses persisted. A widow who had hidden away a clutch of eggs gave two to a young mother with a fevered infant. A soldier slipped a half-loaf of bread beneath a cloth in the chapel for the nuns. An old carpenter made toys from scraps of wood to distract the children from their hunger. In this strange new rhythm, generosity became rebellion, a quiet, unspoken resistance against the slow erosion of their humanity. Meanwhile, the castle guards grew more gaunt and grim. They shared the same rations, but carried the burden of defending a wall that might be attacked at any hour. Their boots no longer shined, their eyes were hollow. They joked less, trained harder, and rarely left their posts unless ordered. The captain, a seasoned veteran with a stiff leg, began inspecting the parapets twice daily, speaking little, observing everything. He knew what few were ready to admit. The longer the siege stretched, the more brittle their defenses would become, not from swords, but from starvation. One evening, the bells rang late, not for prayer, but for accounting. A gathering was called in the courtyard, where the steward climbed a stack of crates and addressed the assembled crowd. His voice, usually dry, now trembled with urgency. "We have provisions left for 37 days. That is, if we hold to the strictest measures." A silence fell over the crowd, heavy, suffocating. No one asked what would happen on the 38th day. They didn't need to. And so the people of the castle turned inward. Meals became ceremonies, each bite measured and slow. Children were taught to chew longer, to drink water before eating, to trick their stomachs. Prayers multiplied, not for victory, but for sustenance, for time, for a miracle. Because now they understood. In a siege, death doesn't only come with blades. Sometimes it arrives as a bowl half full, as the echo of an empty storeroom, as the terrible knowledge that the enemy might never need to lift a finger. Hunger would do their work for them. Sleep under siege becomes a luxury, a fleeting, brittle thing. It comes not when the body desires rest, but when the schedule allows it, and even then it is rarely whole. It is fractured, broken into shifts, filled with sounds and shadows, always uncertain. In the early days, many tried to keep to their former rhythms. wrapping themselves in cloaks and lying in familiar places. But the castle no longer honored such routines. The siege had reshaped time itself. Bells no longer marked hours of prayer and labor. Now they marked the changing of guards, the opening of ration lines, the solemn roll call of the dead. The captain of the watch, a man who once scoffed at anything less than 8 hours of sleep, was now sleeping in 40-minute intervals. He shared a narrow cot in the garrison quarters with a younger soldier, alternating between rest and patrol. Across the castle, similar arrangements emerged. Cots were dragged into storerooms. Ladders leaned against tower alcoves. Blankets spread in crypts and basements. A bed was no longer a personal space, it was a communal utility, rotated in shifts. The luckiest slept 2 or 3 hours at a time. The rest took what they could. The sounds of the night were relentless. Wooden beams creaking overhead, wind howling through arrow slits, the pacing of guards above, babies crying for milk that no longer flowed, rats scurrying across rafters, and beneath it all, the faint, ever-present suspicion that the enemy might be digging tunnels beneath the walls. People whispered about it, said they heard faint knocks in the floorboards, rhythmic and far below. The steward dismissed it as nerves, but even he began glancing at the stone underfoot a little more often. Some rooms were filled entirely with sleepers' rows of bodies, curled like commas on cold floors, wrapped in cloaks and rough blankets. Others slept in doorways, in stairwells, even standing upright in guard towers. A few began to sleepwalk, found wandering the castle by candlelight, eyes open but minds elsewhere. The priests took to sprinkling holy water at dusk, hoping to banish the unease that settled over the keep like smoke. But faith could not close the eyes of the terrified. Even prayer became a nocturnal act, whispered urgently beneath breath, while others tried to rest. Dreams took on a new shape. People dreamt of escape, of feasts, of vast open fields. But more often, they dreamt of sounds booming horns, the clash of swords, screams in the dark. Many awoke in sweats, clutching their chests, unsure if what they heard was imagined or real. The line between the two blurred further each night. A young scribe, normally quiet and soft-spoken, was found shouting at the sky from the ramparts one dawn, convinced he had seen a flaming figure in the clouds. He was calmed and brought inside, but no one laughed. Everyone understood. Children, too, were swept into the rhythm of sleeplessness. Infants grew colicky. Older children became pale and thin, their faces drawn. They slept in huddles, like pups, heads tucked into laps and arms. Mothers tried to comfort them with lullabies, but the melodies lost their warmth in the cold stone halls. Some children were given herbs to help them sleep. Poppy water, valerian rootbutt supplies were scarce and meted out with caution. The line between medicine and mercy narrowed. When a child passed away in their sleep one quiet night, many whispered that it might have been a kindness. To combat the fatigue, new routines formed. A cup of watered wine at sundown, a shared story in the dark, a soldier who recited the same joke at the changing of every watch, less for laughter, more for familiarity, something to keep the mind from drifting into panic. Even small rituals, brushing out one's boots, folding a cloak just so, humming a certain tune took on the weight of significance. They became anchors in the fog of exhaustion. And through it all, the enemy remained silent. No trumpets, no demands, no banners, just the knowledge that they were there, somewhere beyond the woods and hills, waiting. Perhaps they, too, were awake. Perhaps they, too, lay on cold earth, eyes open, listening. But within the castle, sleep had become a battlefield all its own. And as each day passed, as lids drooped heavier and limbs grew sluggish, it became clear that exhaustion would claim many before sword or flame ever had the chance. Because a weary mind is as fragile as a broken gate, and in the siege, every crack matters. It was in the 5th week of the siege that the sounds began to change. The nights had, until then, been thick with silence and speculation. Whispers carried more weight than weapons. But now, across the stillness of the moonless dark, new sounds began to echo, foreign, deliberate, and unmistakably human. A horn, low and distant, would call once, then fall silent. A series of metallic clangs, deliberate and patterned, as if hammer met iron in some unseen camp. Then came the drums, soft at first, then growing louder, then vanishing, as though never there. They did not announce an assault, they simply existed. Like breath, like warning. The guards were the first to notice the change in rhythm. They began keeping detailed logs of what they heard and when. Footsteps across dry leaves beyond the walls, the creaking of wooden beams, faint chants in a language no one recognized. These records became morning rituals, read aloud at the start of each day by the captain of the watch. 2 blasts of the horn at second bell. No visual confirmation. Eastern quadrant. Drumbeat followed shortly after 13 strikes. Rhythmic, uneven spacing. The words offered no strategy, only a growing ledger of dread. By day, the enemy remained invisible. Scouts posted in towers saw nothing but the gentle sway of tree branches, the same blue hills in the distance, and occasional birds rising in panicked flocks. But each night the sounds returned. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, sometimes from beyond the North Tower, other times from the southern ravine. A few claimed to hear whispers along the base of the walls. The old gardener swore that one morning he found a stone perfectly round, smooth as glass, left beside his tools in the courtyard. No one believed him, yet no one laughed. Inside the castle, the unease grew more suffocating. It was one thing to fear a siege engine or a wave of soldiers. It was another to be toyed with. The enemy made no demands, issued no terms, lit no signal fires. Their presence was implied, never confirmed. They played with noise like a cat with a wounded bird, keeping the prey anxious, bleeding its strength one sleepless night at a time. This was a siege of the mind as much as of the body. The priest, a man once firm in his faith and stern in his sermons, began holding vigils each dusk. He would light 7 candles before the altar and recite protective psalms aloud. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, echoed through the chapel, his voice growing more brittle each night. The villagers attended not out of devotion, but desperation. They feared the sounds, not because they portended violence, but because they proved the enemy was listening to. On the 6th night of the new sounds, the bells of the keep rang without warning. A sentry had loosed an arrow into the trees beyond the east wall, claiming to see movement, many shadows, low to the ground, circling. Archers rushed to position. The stones above the gate were manned. The fire oil was heated, but no attack came. Just the wind, just silence again. Then, at dawn, a single arrow was found lodged in the upper wall of the chapel. No message, no blood, no attacker in sight. The arrow was of foreign make-black wood, obsidian point, red fletching. It was placed on the altar like an offering. Whispers of witchcraft began to grow. Some said the enemy was not flesh, but spectre, that the horns were ghostly calls, the drums enchanted. The village midwife, long suspected of having a second sight, claimed the dead were walking beyond the forest's edge. A group of children, pale and sunken-eyed from hunger and terror, said they saw a tall figure in a horned helm standing motionless just beyond the southern tower wall. He never moved, never spoke. When guards looked, he was gone. To restore calm, the captain ordered a patrol beyond the walls, bold sortie, to confirm the enemy's position or drive back scouts. 5 men left by the postern gate before dawn. None returned. No sounds were heard that day. The air grew still. Not even birds called from the trees. The night that followed was quiet, but it was not peace. It was silence loaded with threat. The villagers stopped asking questions. They stopped listening at night. Doors were barred tighter, windows nailed shut, and the sounds, those strange, otherworldly noises, became part of the castle's new rhythm, as expected as meals and prayers. They were not warnings anymore. They were reminders. The enemy was patient, and the siege was just beginning. At last, the waiting ended, not with a whisper, but with a shriek. It came from the south wall. One of the lookouts let out a cry so sharp it cut through the morning haze. An arrow had struck the wooden guardrail just inches from his neck. In an instant, the entire castle shuddered to life. Bells rang, voices barked commands, and feet pounded against stone. The enemy had spoken in their truest language at last. The hiss of bowstrings, the thud of projectiles against timber, the first salvo of war. It wasn't a full assault, just a rain of arrows, but it was enough. The siege was no longer a shadowy game. It had begun to draw blood. The archers on the wall responded with haste and grim efficiency. These were not the pampered knights of romance, but lean, calloused men who had trained for years to loose 5 arrows in the time it took most to notch one. They raised their longbows and returned fire over the battlements, aiming not to kill, but to remind the enemy that this castle would not fall quietly. Arrows screamed into the tree line, some disappearing into the underbrush, others thudding into shields that flashed silver in the morning sun. The enemy, at last, had a face hidden behind helmets and masks, but real, flesh and blood, not phantoms. Oil was heated in great iron kettles hung above the gatehouse. Black and bubbling, it hissed like a nest of serpents. It wasn't used, yet only prepared, the way one might light a torch at the door before nightfall. Its presence was enough. The defenders had methods of their own, and they would not hesitate to use them. Soldiers stationed at the murder holes loaded stones, boiling water, even bundles of nettles soaked in vinegar. It was a siege, yes, but it would be a costly one for the aggressors. The castle's walls were high, and its people, though hungry and weary, were not broken. For many within the castle, this first skirmish was a strange relief. After weeks of eerie silence and unseen menace, there was something to fight, something to push back against. It was as though they had been holding their breath, and at last they could exhale it. Women tore linen strips for binding wounds. Children, now old enough to understand danger, ran messages between towers. Even the elderly, who could not fight, stood at the windows with stones in their hands. But the enemy was cautious. The arrows ceased as quickly as they had begun. No ladders appeared. No battering rams rolled forth. Just a brief, brutal storm of shafts, and then silence. Again, it was a probing, attack test. The defenders had passed, but not without cost. 3 were wounded. One, a boy of just 15, struck in the shoulder, would lose the use of his arm. Another died hours later from a pierced lung. His wife wailed until her voice gave out, and then sat in the chapel, staring at the altar, unmoving. The captain of the watch, blood spattered on his gauntlets, ordered every archer's name recorded. "This is not just defense," he said. "This is memory. Every one of them who holds a bow will be remembered for holding the line." His voice was rough, but his eyes gleamed not with hope, but with purpose. If the enemy sought to grind them down, they would answer with names and defiance. History would not forget their stand, even if the rest of the world never heard of it. And so the castle adapted again. New patrols were organized. Defensive supplies were moved closer to the battlements. The castle's great bells were retuned to ring in patterns, each one signaling a quadrant of attack. The walls, once symbols of security, were now alive with movement, sweat, and strain. The scent of pitch and iron drifted through the air, mingling with the smoke from the cook fires and the sour smell of fear. But still, the defenders held firm. The lord of the castle emerged briefly, clad in a breastplate, untouched by rust, flanked by his sons and retainers. He did not speak, but his present, silent, composed, was enough. The people watched him walk the battlements, his gaze sweeping the horizon. Then he turned and disappeared into the keep once more. Some took comfort in that. Others saw in it a silent prayer. Leadership, after all, is not always a matter of words. Sometimes it is simply the refusal to collapse. That night, the castle glowed with torchlight as men kept watch along the walls. The great kettles still simmered, and the stones were stacked higher. The enemy had touched them now, truly touched them, and the defenders understood something deep and final. This was no longer a siege of might alone. It was a siege of will. The arrows would come again, and when they did, the people of the castle would be waiting, not just with bows and boiling oil, but with the hardened resolve of those who have already survived too much to give in. No wall, no matter how high or thick, can keep out the enemies that breed within. With the enemy's arrows quieted for now, and the castle defenses bristling with new resolve, a different kind of battle began, one not waged with steel, but with sweat, filth, and decay. Illness, long dormant, began to stir. It crept into the corners of the castle like mist rising from a graveyard. It spread not with violence, but through touch, through breath, through the shared air of too many people pressed into too little space. It began quietly with a cough, a fever, a child who wouldn't wake, but soon it grew into a silent army of its own. The first to fall ill was a washerwoman, known for her sharp tongue and tireless work. She was found half-conscious in the laundry shed, skin hot to the touch and lips cracked. By the next morning, 2 more were fevered on, elderly mason and a scullion boy who cleaned chamber pots. The castle physician, a man who favored garlic amulets and leeches over newer practices, pronounced it a common flux, something to be watched but not feared. He was wrong. By the end of the week, a dozen lay ill. By the end of the second, the chapel was full of moans and the scent of sickness. With limited food and poor sanitation, the conditions inside the castle had become ripe for disease. Buckets of waste overflowed in corners where drains no longer flowed. Rats, driven inward by hunger and noise, scurried freely across rafters and sleeping bodies. Fleas multiplied in straw bedding. Water drawn from the lower well began to taste of metal and rot. Even the castle's upper chambers, once symbols of order and safety, became infected. A knight's daughter, just 11, collapsed in the corridor outside the solar. No one dared touch her until gloves were fetched and holy water sprinkled. Panic bloomed in silence. No one dared name the sickness aloud, but many remembered tales from older days, plagues that had swept through cities, turning bodies black and breath sour. The steward moved swiftly, designating an entire wing of the servants' hall as an infirmary. Thin curtains were hung to separate the sick from the rest, but everyone knew it was too little, too late. Disease does not respect cloth. Priests were ordered to pray over the ill. The castle's almoner began distributing dried herbs, vinegar cloths, and relics said to ward off pestilence. But faith has its limits, and the people had begun to cross them. Every cough became suspect, every shiver a source of terror. Friends no longer embraced. Meals were taken in silence and at a distance. Buckets of ashes were placed at thresholds to purify shoes. Lime was sprinkled in the latrines, and incense burned constantly in the chapel until even prayer stank of smoke. Still, the sickness spread. Some burned sprigs of juniper in their rooms. Others tied charms to doorposts. The priest blessed them all, and then began sleeping outside the chapel, too afraid to lie among the pews where the dead had been laid. Fear sharpened into suspicion. A rumor spread that a woman from the outer hamlet taken in during the early days of the siege had brought the disease with her. Her family was driven from their shelter in the lower stables. Stones were thrown. The guards intervened too late. Her husband was beaten to death, and her children vanished into the tunnels below the castle. No one searched for them. The enemy beyond the walls had done less harm than the fear that now governed the people within. To maintain some sense of order, the captain instituted a color code: strips of cloth green for healthy, yellow for recovering, red for the sequer tied to doors and worn on arms. Those with red were forbidden from public spaces. Food was delivered in bowls, left at doorsteps, collected after sunset. But enforcement was uneven. Some tore off the red and hid among the healthy. Others, falsely accused, were banished to the infirmary and never seen again. The line between caution and cruelty faded quickly. The dead were not buried, but burned. There was no longer space to dig, and the fear of contagion was too strong. A pyre was built beyond the outer stables, fed each evening by bodies wrapped in linens. The smoke drifted low and bitter through the castle. Children watched the flames with dull eyes, too tired to cry. And yet, life went on. Meals continued. Watches were maintained. The baker's boy still rang the bell to signal curfew, though his hands now trembled with fever. In the end, it wasn't the sickness itself that hollowed the cassolet, was what it revealed. How thin the line between order and chaos truly was. How quickly people could turn on each other. How fear could fracture even the closest bonds. The enemy still waited beyond the walls, patient and well-fed. But the true siege was already underway, fought, not with arrows or oil, but with coughs, accusations, and the quiet, bone-deep certainty that no help would come. The walls stood, but what lived within them had already begun to unravel. As the sickness grew and the enemy remained faceless beyond the walls, the people of the castle turned inward to their thoughts, to their memories, and most of all, to their faith. In normal times, religion had been a rhythm, a custom woven through the day like thread through cloth. Bells rang for prayer, hands folded by habit. But now, Faith became a lifeline. It was no longer simply recitation, it was pleading, bargaining, surrender. The chapel, once a place of comfort and reflection, became a site of desperation, its air thick with smoke, incense, and whispered prayers that barely hid the quiver of fear. The priest, Father Ambrose, had aged 20 years in as many days. His beard had grown long and knotted, and his robes hung loose on his shrinking frame. But his voice still held strength, especially at dusk, when he stood before the altar and offered his nightly homily. He no longer spoke of mercy. Now he spoke of tests, of trials, of purgation through suffering. The Lord refines his children in fire, he declared one night as the smoke of burning corpses drifted through the chapel windows. We are not punished, we are chosen to endure. Some wept, others stared. A few walked out and never returned. Outside the walls of the chapel, faith fractured into many forms. Some clung to Scripture with white-knuckled fervor, quoting psalms under their breath as they scrubbed floors, boiled roots, or buried the dead. Others turned to older practices, the burning of sage, the drawing of symbols on doorways, the whispering of protective charms learned from grandmothers long buried. The nuns began leaving small offerings in the corners of the courtyard, bundles of rosemary tied with hair, bones wrapped in cloth, stones arranged in circles. Father Ambrose saw and said nothing. In the cramped spaces of the castle, every object became a relic, every word a spell. An old man claimed a shard of stained glass had healing power and held it to his fevered daughter's head each night. A soldier knelt before a rusted iron cross he'd worn since his first campaign, swearing oaths to saints he could no longer name. A mother buried a lock of her dead son's hair beneath the chapel altar, believing it would protect her other child from the plague. These acts were not sanctioned, they were not consistent, but they were all, in their own way, acts of survival. But as faith deepened, so too did its darker edge. Guilt grew like mold in the corners of minds. Some believed the siege was a punishment for hidden sins of pride, of lust, of cruelty left unconfessed. People began accusing one another, not just of theft or hoarding, but of spiritual fault. A woman was branded a harlot after her husband died suddenly, though she had done nothing but survive. A boy was beaten for speaking during Mass. A servant was locked in the pantry for sneezing during prayer. The line between devotion and fanaticism blurred, then vanished. To counter the growing hysteria, Father Ambrose instituted a vigil, one candle, lit each hour, to burn continuously in the chapel until the siege ended. Volunteers took turns tending the flame, reciting prayers and psalms through the night. It became a holy watch, a spiritual wall within the physical one. People came to believe that so long as the flame burned, the castle would not fall. When, one stormy night, the candle guttered out in a sudden gust of wind, panic seized the keep. 4 people claimed to see ghostly shapes on the parapets that night. The flame was relit within minutes, but the damage was done. Faith, like food, was running low, yet still there were moments of grace. A dying woman sang a lullaby to comfort those in the sick wing. A scribe copied psalms onto scraps of cloth and passed them out to frightened children. Father Ambrose took confession every morning, even as his own cough worsened. And at dawn each day, the bell in the chapel tower was rung not in alarm, but in stubborn, ringing defiance. It was not a call to prayer, it was a statement. We are still here. The enemy outside could not have known what faith was doing within the walls, how it bent and broke and reformed itself. To them, it may have seemed a silence, but to those inside, it was a constant, desperate, chorus of pleading hearts trying to fill the vast, empty space between themselves and salvation. And though the smoke of incense now mingled with the smoke of the dead, and the cross above the altar was tarnished with ash, the people knelt anyway, because in the dark, even a flicker of belief is brighter than no light at all. In every siege, there comes a moment when survival turns not just on food and strength, but on trust and the slow, sickening realization that trust is running thin. By the 7th week, the walls were holding, but something more fragile was not. The unity of the people inside. Whispers traveled faster than orders. Glances lingered longer. Accusations were no longer shouted, but murmured behind hands, carved into wood beams, scratched into the soot-dark walls of the storerooms. There were traitors among them, the rumors said. Someone inside the castle wanted the gates opened. It began with small things. A bundle of salted meat gone missing, a guard found asleep at his post, an empty jug of oil left beneath the gatehouse where it should not have been. The steward dismissed them as mistakes, symptoms of hunger and fear, but others were not so sure. When a rope was found lowered from the western parapet cut cleanly, its end swaying in the night air, the captain of the watch ordered the entire garrison turned out and questioned. No one confessed, no one saw, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and it began to grow. In the tavern-turned-refuge hall, eyes narrowed, families huddled closer, reluctant to share meals, even conversation. Those who had joined the castle from outlying villages were viewed with suspicion, strangers in a place where familiarity had become survival. A young man, once a mason's apprentice, was beaten for speaking too warmly of the enemy's discipline. They wait. They don't waste lives, he'd said, perhaps admiringly, perhaps not. Either way, his nose was broken by a soldier before the hour was out. He survived, but the message was clear. Even words could betray you now. In the inner keep, the Lord's advisors debated in hushed tones. The siege had frayed their hierarchy as much as it had frayed the people. The steward argued for tighter curfews, stricter rationing. The captain wanted public trials. The priest, thin and gray, now pleaded for restraint. Despair is the greater enemy, he warned. If we turn on each other, the gates may as well be opened. But fear does not listen to sermons. Fear sharpens into certainty, and certainty into punishment. By week's end, 2 men had been locked in the dungeon, one for stealing wax, another for slipping beyond the courtyard at night. No evidence, just whispers. In the dark spaces of the castle, the storage cellars, the latrines, the silent archways at the base of the curtain, all those whispers turned into murmurs of rebellion. What if we let them in? Some dared to ask. What if they'll spare us? There were stories now of castles taken swiftly, where the common folk were spared, where only the knights were executed, where the lords fell and the people were fed. No one could prove such tales, but they persisted, repeated by those whose hunger had outgrown their loyalty. For them, surrender was not betrayal, it was survival. The guards grew paranoid, doors were double-barred, torches burned late into the night. A network of informants began to form that, officially sanctioned, but inevitable. One woman began exchanging bits of food for rumors. Another, a former scribe, offered to write anonymous reports on those who seemed too calm, too clean, too confident. The castle had once been a community. Now it was a trap with too many eyes, too many ears, and too little mercy. Still, no rebellion came. No gate was opened, but the thought remained, poisonous, potent. One night, a soldier was found dead in the stables, throat slit, his sword still sheathed. Whether it was murder or suicide, no one could say. But by morning, people were whispering of secret meetings, of coded knocks, of tunnels forgotten by the old builders. The steward ordered all underground passages sealed. The priest led prayers of exorcism, but no wall can bar thoughts. Once treason enters the mind, it does not leave. And yet there were those who resisted the pull of despair. A baker, gaunt but resolute, left half her daily ration outside the infirmary each morning. A child caught stealing was gently scolded, then given extra bread by the same man he'd tried to rob. The captain of the watch, though sleepless and limping now, made a point of eating in view of the soldiers. No better, no worse. We hold, he would say. Even if all else fails, we hold. It was not much, but in a time of whispered rebellion, small acts of faith became acts of courage. The enemy outside remained silent. They watched, perhaps, waiting for the cracks to widen. Perhaps they knew what the defenders were just beginning to understand. A siege does not require force, only time. And time, in this castle, had begun to work its quiet treachery. It was on the 47th day that the enemy revealed what they had been building all along. At dawn, as mist still clung to the treetops, and the castle walls stood shadowed in cold blue light, the horns sounded again 3 blasts, long and hollow, echoing across the valley. But this time, they were not alone. From beyond the hills, shapes emerge, massive, lumbering silhouettes that seemed at first like hills, moving of their own accord. Then the sun caught the iron and wood, and the defenders understood. Siege machines. A collective shudder ran through the castle. Even the youngest child could feel it, the shift from psychological torment to mechanical certainty. These were not raiding parties or archer flanks. These were engines of destruction. The trebuchets, tall as towers, rolled forward on thick wheels bound with iron. Behind them came carts of stone shot and barrels of pitch. Still farther back, half hidden by pines and smoke, was the great Ramit's head, carved like a snarling beast, mounted on wheels, covered with hide and fireproofed with wet clay. The enemy had been patient. Now they were ready. The captain of the watch climbed the highest parapet with his lieutenants and stood in silence. His jaw worked. His hands were still. Then he turned and began barking orders. Archers to the south wall, oil to the gatehouse, fire signals to the west tower. The time for waiting had passed. Now came the test of all they had prepared, whether stone and sweat could stand against fire and fury. The castle bells rang not for warning, but for war. Those within the walls, gaunt and sleepless, grabbed what tools or weapons they could. Some wept as they tied their hair back. Others tightened belts and said nothing at all. The trebuchets opened fire at mid-morning. The first stone missed the wall by 20 feet and crushed an empty chicken coop in the courtyard. The second struck the outer parapet, showering the south wall in dust and broken rock. The noise was immense, like the cracking of the world's spine. With every shot, the castle shook. Arrows returned, but they bounced harmlessly off the distant frames of the machines. One archer, desperate and furious, loosed a flaming arrow that arced high and fell pitifully short. The captain did not rebuke him. At least he tried. By afternoon, the courtyard was a haze of smoke and noise. A part of the outer wall had buckled. The defenders raced to shore it up with timber and sacks of earth. 2 men were buried alive when a corner collapsed. Their screams stopped within minutes. The oil was heated above the gate, the cauldrons bubbling like witches' brews. But the ram had not yet come. It waited, distant but inevitable, its massive iron snout gleaming in the low sun. Everyone knew, when it moved, the real battle would begin. To buy time, the defenders launched their own countermeasures. At nightfall, under the cover of darkness and fog, a small group of soldiers attempted to sneak out through the old postern gate to sabotage the siege towers. They carried flasks of pitch, wrapped in cloth and sealed in wax. Only one man returned, bleeding, eyes wide with horror. They knew, he said, over and over. They were waiting. They knew. No one asked what he saw. His silence told enough. Inside the castle, the atmosphere became heavier than even the smoke could explain. Mothers clutched children. Old men whispered prayers. Even the youngest learned to tell the sound of a trebuchet sling from the whoosh of a falling stone. Sleep vanished altogether. Food was no longer eaten, but swallowed mechanically. Fires burned around the clock, not for warmth, but for readiness. And above all, the ram remained still, its presence, like a shadow stretched over the castle, unyielding, inevitable. On the 3rd day of bombardment, a boulder struck the chapel's steeple, shattering its bell. The crash was heard across the entire keep. It was more than symbolic, it was demoralizing. The bell had rung every morning since the siege began. Now it was silent. Father Ambrose wept openly, then climbed the pulpit and continued his prayers, hoarse but unbroken. The people knelt with him, even as the stones fell outside. Faith, it seemed, could still be louder than stone. When the ram finally began its crawl toward the gatehouse, a silence fell inside the walls. Not fear, not prayer, just silence. People stopped what they were doing and listened. The creak of wheels, the slow chant of enemy soldiers in rhythm with its roll, the metallic groan of a weapon born to break doors and hope alike. The captain of the guard placed a hand on the gate's inner beam, as though by touching it he might keep it whole. "Hold," he said, voice low. "We hold." And for now they did. Arrows poured down from the battlements. Pitch was poured, torches thrown. Flames licked the roof of the ram, but it continued forward. A man dropped a stone and struck its side. The sound was like thunder against an anvil. But the beast rolled on. It did not stop. It did not fear. It simply obeyed. The first strike came at dusk, a deep, resonant blow that echoed through every wall, every bone, every heart. The gates trembled. Dust fell from the ceiling of the great hall. Somewhere, a baby began to scream. The people knew then, beyond all doubt, that the wall between survival and ruin was measured not in faith or will, but in inches of wood. And the enemy was coming, one strike at a time. As the enemy's ram pounded the gate with grim rhythm, the people of the castle began to retreat, physically, emotionally, spiritually, into the earth. The halls above were no longer safe. Stones cracked under each strike. The once grand entry to the great hall had begun to split, hairline fractures running like veins across ancient wood and mortar. The air was choked with dust. Sleep was impossible, fear constant. And so the survivors sought refuge beneath the stones, into the cellars, into the crypts, into the bowels of the castle, where even light hesitated to follow. These subterranean spaces were not built for habitation. They were storage vaults, wine chambers, hidden passageways known only to stewards and old masons. But in siege, even the unlivable becomes sanctuary. Barrels of grain were rolled aside to make sleeping space. Old bones were swept from corners. Spiders, bats, and rats were no longer feared but tolerated, fellow inhabitants of the dark. Here, in the cool, damp quiet beneath the keep, the people carved out a different sort of life, one not ruled by clocks or bells, but by instinct and shadows. Torches and lanterns became sacred objects, their flames rationed and guarded. Oil was precious. Each flicker of light cost something. The underground chambers filled with flickering shadows that danced against ancient stone, warping faces and turning every footstep into an echo of dread. Yet it was safer here. The roar of the ram was muffled. The scream of stone cracking above was dulled to a low groan, and for a moment it was possible to pretend that the end was not creeping closer with each strike. Among these tunnels, stories re-emerged, some old, some invented to soothe children. Tales of kings who escaped through secret passageways, of hidden rooms filled with treasure and food untouched by time, of saints who wandered underground for 40 days and emerged unscathed. These were not told for belief, but for breath. In the dark, stories were a kind of oxygen, and the children so pale now, so thin listened with wide eyes, clutching their mother's hands, their minds conjuring heroes to stand where real defenders were breaking. Yet the underground life came with its own price. The air grew foul with each passing hour. Moisture crept into skin and lungs. The sick deteriorated faster in the damp, and there was little room for the dead. The steward designated one disused passage as a burial tunnel, a narrow space where bodies were laid head to foot, wrapped in cloth. No graves, no prayers, just darkness. It was said the dead lingered there, their breath mingling with the living. Whether true or not, no one lingered near its entrance for long. Not all used the lower levels as sanctuary. Some used them for secrecy. The tunnels offered corridors, free of surveillance, free of guards and laws. It was whispered that rebel groups, those who still considered opening the gates, met down there. Others, emboldened by the anonymity of the dark, committed thefts and worse. A small girl vanished one night. Her slipper was found near the southern crypt, the one with the sealed door that no one remembered unlocking. No one spoke of it again, but mothers gripped their children tighter after that. Still, the castle's leadership tried to maintain order. The steward and priest began descending each day to speak with the people, offering reassurances, bread, and psalms. The captain of the guard refused to come down. "My place is above," he said, "where the wood splinters," but his absence was felt. Some began to question who truly led the survivors, now those who fought or those who huddled and endured. And in that space of uncertainty, power began to shift in quiet, unseen ways. By the third day underground, maps of the tunnels were drawn from memory. Rooms were marked for sleeping, for cooking, for storage. A hierarchy developed not by birth, but by usefulness. The man with the flint became more valued than the woman with titles. The boy who could crawl through tight shafts and bring back water was protected like a prince. Here, in the shadow of despair, a new world emerged, primitive, makeshift, alive. And yet, no matter how deep they went, the war found them. One morning, a massive tremor shook the cellars. Dust poured from the ceiling. A barrel split open. Somewhere, stone cracked like thunder. The battering ram had breached the first gate. The walls still held, but barely. The people underground froze, not because they could hear the enemy, but because they could hear the defenders, screaming, rallying, bleeding. Life underground was no longer about waiting. It was about bracing, about preparing for the moment when the upper world would fall, and the only thing left would be what they had built in the dark, their last sanctuary or their tomb. By the 9th week of the siege, hunger had stopped being a condition. It had become a religion, one felt not just in the gut, but in the mind, in the marrow, in the strange, silent rituals people adopted to trick their own bodies. Meals had long since ceased to be events. They were now ceremonies of scarcity. A single crust of bread was divided like relics from a saint's bones. A broth, boiled from rat bones and dried onion peel, was sipped with reverence. Every bite was accompanied by gratitude and shame, by relief and fear, because every bite was one less. People spoke less, not just out of fatigue, but to conserve saliva. Tongues thickened, skin drew tight over cheekbones. The eyes of even the youngest gleamed with a fevered intensity. Starvation is not simply decayed, is transformation. The body rewrites itself. Muscles vanish. The stomach shrinks to a knotted thread. Thoughts become narrower, more urgent, turning again and again to food. Not just food to come, but food that once was. People dreamed not of feasts, but of scraps of crust dipped in honey, a lump of cheese, a bruised pear. Memory itself became a torment. And then came the visions. They began as dreams. A man woke laughing, believing he'd found a fig in his coat. A woman kissed the air, whispering thanks to a ghost who had brought her soup. At first these were considered signs of weakness. Then they became more elaborate. People began seeing things while awake. A banquet table laid across the flagstones, goblets brimming with red wine that shimmered and rippled without being touched. A boy, only 10, swore he saw a roast duck waddle through the great hall, its legs wrapped in rosemary. He chased it into a wall and broke 2 fingers. When his mother scolded him, he asked if she could smell the thyme. These were not the ravings of madmen, nor the stories of jesters. They were shared. A woman in the infirmary whispered about white apples hanging from the ceiling. 2 others claimed they'd seen them too. A soldier on watch reported seeing a loaf of bread rise from the ground and float slowly into the sky. The priest dismissed these visions as trials sent from God. The steward, more pragmatic, ordered everyone to report hallucinations to him directly, quietly, without punishment. Within days, his ledger overflowed. The hallucinations were not always pleasant. As hunger deepened, so too did the cruelty of the mind. Some saw fire dripping from the walls, red as wine. Others heard whispers telling them to bite their own fingers. One man tried to eat candle wax. Another gnawed on a leather strap until his teeth broke. A young girl, barely 6, was found chewing on her own hair, whispering to an invisible feast that she was almost ready. Sleep no longer brought escape, but new torments. Roasted meats that vanished when touched, platters that turned to ash, rivers of soup that dried before the cup could be filled. In this realm of slow starvation, morality began to shift. The idea of theft became fuzzy, elastic. A woman caught stealing dried peas from a soldier's satchel claimed she had done it in a dream. "I thought it wasn't real," she wept. "I thought it was another vision." He didn't press charges. He had also been seeing things. There was, by this point, an unspoken understanding. The mind was no longer under full control. Even those still lucid feared what they might become. Whispers of cannibalism flickered at the edges of conversation, never voiced directly, just glances toward the dead, too fresh, not yet buried. A man stared too long at a corpse being carried away, and licked his lips before catching himself. A mother, wild-eyed and sunken, asked if the bones of the dead could be boiled for more than just broth. The question was met with silence. No one said no, but no one said yes, either. The line between hunger and horror had blurred. To fight back against madness, the survivors created small routines. They counted stones, recited old recipes like prayers, held imaginary feasts where each person described a favorite dish in slow, sacred detail. One night, the priest organized a banquet of memory where each person told of a meal that had once made them weep. One man described the way his grandmother had salted goose fat and spread it on black bread. Another remembered roasted chestnuts crackling in winter. By the end, half the room was in tears. But tears, too, cost moisture. In the silence that followed that night's gathering, the captain of the watch was found staring at a wall, unmoving. When approached, he murmured, "I smelled cloves." His eyes were glassy. "My mother's bread had cloves in it." He did not speak for 3 days afterward. His orders were given in writing. And when he finally spoke again, it was only to say, "Don't trust the smells. They're always too sweet." Starvation changes people, not just their bodies, but their souls. It strips away the stories they tell themselves, the manners, the civility. It leaves only want. And yet, even in this, the people clung to each other. Not all, not always, but enough. A woman who found a single apple seed tucked into the lining of her cloak gave it to a child who had stopped speaking. A soldier cut the last thread of jerky in half and gave it to the man who once spit at him for being born poor. These were not acts of hope. They were acts of rebellion against the slow unraveling. For in the end, it was not the hunger that destroyed them. It was the fear that the hunger would strip away who they were. And as the bones of the castle grew louder under siege, the bones of its people held on not just to life, but to meaning, to dignity, even if they had to do it with their minds half on fire. There were few ways to communicate with the world beyond the castle walls. With the gates sealed and the enemies surrounding them in silent dread, messengers on horseback were a distant memory. Flags could not be raised, no one to see them. Bells no longer rang, their toll had become target practice. And so, when the need for contact became unbearable, when hope flickered like the last stub of candlelit, fell to the old ways, the secret ways, the desperate ways, whispered messages, silent signals, messages in the night. It began with pigeons, not many, just 4, kept by a retired falconer who lived in the corner tower of the outer bailey. He had kept them for sport in younger days, trained them with care, cooed at them with love. Now, he became the most important man in the castle. Messages were written in charcoal on tiny scraps of cloth, then folded and bound to the bird's legs with thread. Simple words: under siege, alive, barely, help, food, gone. One bird returned, the others never did. Whether shot from the sky or simply lost, no one could say. But each absence was a needle in the fabric of hope. When the pigeons failed, the torch codes were revived. 2 towers, one in the east, one in the west, were manned each night by men with mirrors and covered lanterns. They used simple light flashes based on old merchant signals once used to warn of raids. 3 flashes for danger, 1 long, 1 short for send help. It was an old system, slow and fragile. On clear nights, they thought they saw flashes, returned barely visible, distant, uncertain, but no help came. Some believed the enemy mimicked the codes, sending back nonsense to toy with them. Others believed the flashes were never real. Next came the runners, young men and women, lean and fast, promised food and safety for their families if they would crawl through the old tunnels beneath the curtain wall. Some tunnels had collapsed decades ago. Others were forgotten by most. But a few were mapped barely wide enough for a child, still dry, snaking outward beneath the enemy lines. One girl, no older than 13, made it a mile before she was caught. Her body was returned the next morning, laid out just beyond the moat. Her hands were tied, her lips sewn shut. No message needed. The enemy understood the game. Still, the people tried. They carved prayers into the undersides of barrels and floated them down the stream that fed the lower cistern. They tied scraps of parchment to cats and loosed them through gaps in the wall, hoping they'd wander into freedom. One soldier, half mad with hunger, claimed to have spoken through the stones to an echo he believed was an ally in a besieged monastery to the west. He tapped out messages in rhythmic knocks. They knocked back, he swore, but when others tried, they heard only silence. The steward, ever meticulous, organized a record of all outgoing messages. He kept them in a book bound with horsehide, each failed attempt carefully logged with dates, methods, outcomes. At first, the ledger was a symbol of endurance, but as the pages filled with failure, it became a monument to futility. Eventually, he stopped writing. The book was left open on the chapel altar beside the broken bell. And yet, despite every silence, the people continued. Because sending a message was not just about reaching someone, it was about reminding themselves that they still existed, that someone might care, that the world outside the walls had not vanished entirely. One night, a boy snuck to the highest tower and lit a fire with stolen oil. He burned his own blanket to make the flames high. The smoke rose fast, curling against the stars. It was madness, but when the people saw it, they didn't scold him. They stood in the courtyard and watched, silent, as the sky caught their grief and carried it upward. In the following days, a new kind of message spread, this time not to the outside, but inward. Chalk markings on walls, scratched notes on planks, a handprint in soot, symbols that meant safe room, food hidden, child sleeping here. A language born of crisis, a way for those still living to speak to one another. When fear had made words too sharp, the captain, once skeptical of such signs, began using them himself. A red smear above a door meant guard wounded. 3 lines etched into a barrel meant not water. Even the priest began leaving messages written in Latin, folded into shapes, slipped beneath pillows or into prayer bowls. You are seen. Do not fear the silence. Your soul is stronger than your stomach. Small words, fragile as moth wings, but they carried something heavier than news. They carried presence. And so, as the walls groaned and the gates splintered, the people sent their words out into the dark, even if they never expected a reply. The siege might block their roads, break their windows, steal their voices, but it could not fully sever the thread between hope and expression. They would write until the ink ran dry, until the candles guttered out, because even a message never received is still a refusal to vanish, a refusal to be forgotten, a whisper against the dark. By the time the 100th day arrived, the castle was no longer a fortress. It was a wound that had refused to close. Its stones were blackened in places, its once groomed halls stripped of ornament, its great doors now braced with timber beams so warped and cracked they seemed to groan even when untouched. The enemy's ram still struck, though not constantly, now only at intervals, as if to remind the people inside that pressure need not be relentless to be effective, just steady, just patient. The siege had entered its final act, though none could say how long it would last. And in that atmosphere of slow collapse, a decision was made. The captain of the guard, drawn and sleepless, called for a sortie, not a full charge, not suicide, just a small, swift team of men trained to move fast, strike hard, and slip out unseen. Their goal was simple: sabotage, disable a trebuchet, burn a siege tower, cut down the ram if possible, or, at the very least, draw enemy attention long enough to give the defenders above time to repair the battered gateposts. It was a desperate gamble, born not of arrogance, but of a dwindling set of choices. The inner gate was failing. Food was a memory. Morale had curdled. Something had to be done. 12 volunteers were chosen. Not all were soldiers. 2 were hunters. 1 was a former thief. Another, a mason who had mapped the terrain outside in better years. They were given black cloaks, daggers, shortbows, and sacks of pitch. No plate, no noise. Their names were spoken in the chapel before they departed, and small scraps of real bread were pressed into their hands as tokens of faith. The priest did not speak of victory. He spoke of witness. "Let the stones remember you," he whispered. The sortie left through the postern gate beneath the kitchen tower, just before the moon reached its height. The gate, hidden behind stacked barrels and soot-dark stone, had not been used in over 30 years. Its hinges shrieked once, then fell silent. No one spoke as the 12 vanished into the woods, into the blackness between torchlines. Those left behind stood atop the walls, breath steaming in the cold, eyes straining. For hours there was no sound, only the wind and the creak of wood far in the distance. Then came the screams. Not many, not loud, just one cry, short and sharp, like a blade dragged across iron. A torch flared in the enemy camp. Then another. Shadows moved rapidly. Arrows, faint in the dark, arced skyward and vanished. The watchers on the walls tensed, ready for a rush, but none came. Silence returned. One by one, the torches beyond the walls dimmed again, and the forest was once again just trees. No figures returned. No signal was given. No fire blazed from siege towers. The sortie had failed. At dawn, the gate was opened briefly. A body lay just beyond the tree line, face down, hands open, legs twisted at unnatural angles. He was one of the hunters. His cloak was soaked with blood and pine tar. In his right hand, still clenched, was a blackened arrowhead, snapped in half. There were no other signs. The others were simply gone. Grief, already a daily companion, bloomed into something more lethal: resignation. The castle was filled not with cries, but with silence so deep it seemed to absorb sound. The volunteers had been a symbol not just of defiance, but of possibility. Their failure echoed louder than any siege engine. Children looked at the walls differently. The old cook who had fed them before the siege disappeared into the crypt and did not return. Even the captain, whose decision it had been, walked without speaking for 3 days. His sword was seen laid beside the chapel altar, untouched. In their absence, rumors filled the void. Some claimed the volunteers had been captured, bribed, set loose to sneak back in and open the gate from within. Others believed they had escaped and were now wandering the hills, seeking another army, another lord, another hope. A woman swore she saw one of them at the base of the wall 3 nights later, staring upward, unmoving, as if deciding whether to call out or disappear again. The next morning, footprints were found in the frost below the ramparts, but no trail, no direction, only absence. The captain eventually resumed his post, but he was changed. His orders were shorter, his tone colder. He no longer checked the wall repairs himself. Instead, he stood atop the western tower most nights, staring outward with hollow eyes. It was said he spoke the names of the 12 aloud each dusk, one by one, as if refusing to let them be forgotten. The sortie became legend almost immediately, a tale retold in whispers, reshaped by hope and hunger. Children played games, assigning names to invisible heroes who had slipped past enemy lines and now watched over them from the trees. But for the adults, the failure meant something different. It meant they were alone, entirely. No help was coming. No secret attack would save them. The siege would end, yes, but it would end on the enemy's terms. And yet, even in failure, something remained. A fragment of defiance, a memory of movement, the belief that someone had tried, even when hope had turned brittle. And perhaps that, in the end, was the most human thing left in the castle. Not survival, not strategy, just the refusal to accept the silence. A black cloak disappearing into the trees, carrying the last words of a people who still wanted to fight, even if they were never heard again. It began as a smell, sharp, acrid, unmistakable, not the smoke of hearth fires or boiling pitch, but of something more furious, something wrong. At first, it drifted gently through the lower corridors, like a misplaced shadow. A cook noticed it, then a soldier, then 3 children whose dreams were pierced by coughing fits. By the time the steward roused from his restless sleep and looked toward the eastern tower, the glow was already visibly orange licking through cracks in the stone, dancing against the frost of the pre-dawn sky. Fire, real fire. Not imagined, not threatened. Fire in the keep. Panic moved faster than flames. Buckets were grabbed, water hauled from the main cistern in a frantic, uneven rhythm. But the fire had started in the grain stores where the last sacks of flour, meal, and barley were kept under constant guard. A single spark had found the dry wood of the shelving, or perhaps oil left too near the grain. Perhaps sabotage, perhaps accident, it didn't matter. The flames bloomed like a second sun, and within minutes, the most precious room in the castle had become a furnace. Stone cracked, barrels exploded, men screamed, the defenders tried, gods, they tried. Lines were formed, blankets soaked, doors slammed. One brave soul wrenched open the iron shutter above the fire to give the smoke a path upward. It only drew the flames faster. Within the hour, the eastern third of the keep was uninhabitable. 3 soldiers were lost, 2 children trapped in a storeroom, a nun suffocated while trying to drag out a cart of onions. The priest gave her last rites, with his hands trembling from heat burns. As the smoke rose over the battlements, the enemy responded not with assault, but with song, faint, mocking, wordless. A slow, steady chant carried from the tree line, its rhythm matching the pulse of the ram. It was not a war cry, it was a funeral hymn. The people on the walls, black with soot, said nothing. They simply listened. Some wept. Others closed their eyes and leaned into the stone, as though the walls themselves might offer comfort. But none turned away. You don't look away from a pyre when it holds your hope. The fire was finally contained, but not defeated. It left the storerooms as rubble. Their shelves melted, their walls buckled. The grain was gone, the reserve oil, gone. The ropes, the sacks, the sealed jars of pickled rootsall ash. The steward's tallies meant nothing now. There was nothing to count. The floor collapsed into the cellar beneath, dragging a young guard with it. His voice echoed once, then silence. They marked the area with chalk. No one went near it again. By midday, the survivors gathered in the central courtyard, not by order, by instinct. The smoke still hung thick in the upper halls. The sky, already gray with winter haze, had turned to bronze. No snow, no rain, just cold and smoke and silence. The lord of the castle stood atop the chapel steps, eyes ringed with ash, his hands blackened. He said nothing for a long time, then only this: "We hold." His voice cracked. Some repeated the words, some did not. The meaning had changed. The fire became the dividing line. Before, there had been hope, however frail. After, there was only survival. People no longer asked how long the siege would last. They asked who would last. Meals became shared hallucinations, roasted rats carved like venison, mold scraped from stale crusts like cheese. Clean water was filtered through linen, and each cup passed from mouth to mouth with reverence. The infirmary filled, not just with the sick, but the dying. No more herbs, no more poppy, only wet cloths and quiet prayers. In the burned-out remains of the storeroom, someone etched a phrase into the charred stone. No one saw it done. No one took credit. But by evening, it had become a place of pilgrimage, just for words, scorched into blackened stone. We are still here. People touched it as they passed. Some left stones. Others knelt and said nothing. It was not a shrine to victory. It was a grave marker for the future they no longer had, but it was theirs. It was human. It meant something. That night, the wind shifted. The smoke that had drifted inward began to roll outward, curling over the walls and toward the enemy lines. For once, the castle was quiet, not because it was suffocating, but because it was watching. The enemy must have seen the scars, the broken towers, the hollow gatehouse. They must have smelled the ashes, but they did not attack. Perhaps they were waiting for the castle to collapse on its own. Or perhaps they feared what remained, not strength, but desperation. For in a place already stripped of warmth, fire had come not as death, but as revelation. Everything had been burned away, but the will to endure. And in that grim clarity, the people of the castle found something strange and awful and fierce. They would not last forever, but until then, they would not kneel. The siege, like a serpent coiled too long, began to constrict. It was no longer an affair of fire and stone, but of pressure, pure and relentless. The enemy had tightened their rings. Every visible gap in the trees now held a figure, distant and still. No messengers came, no birds flew. Not even wind dared cross the courtyard without a whisper. The castle had become an island in time adrift, sinking, half forgotten even by those who lived inside it. And that was when the banner appeared. It was planted in silence, just beyond bow range. A tall wooden pole, bearing a cloth of dark crimson, embroidered with a white sigil none in the castle recognized. Below it, a black flag fluttered unmistakable, not a threat, an invitation. Parley. The decision to respond did not come easily. Arguments raged in the Lord's hall. The captain of the guard refused. You do not speak to vultures while you still breathe. The steward, gaunt and sleepless, counseled caution. We speak not because we're weak, but because we still exist. There's a difference. The priest simply bowed his head and muttered prayers for strength. In the end, it was the Lord himself who stood and said, "We will listen. No more, no less." The envoy arrived at midday, alone but unafraid. A woman, cloaked in gray, face hidden behind a mask of silver. She carried no weapon. Her voice, when she spoke, was chimerally so. She brought no threats, only terms. "The siege will end," she said, "when the gates open willingly. No fire, no slaughter, only passage. You will be spared if you surrender your arms and your titles. The Lord must kneel, the captain must disarm. The grain you've hidden must be given up. The castle will be ours, but you, if compliant, will live." The silence that followed was vast. The great hall, once full of arguments, held only breath. Some stared at the floor. Others looked at the Lord, waiting for his answer. But he said nothing. Not yet. Outside, the people already knew. Word of the envoy had reached every corridor, every cellar, every room, and with it came choice. Not revolution, there was no energy left for that, but something quieter, sadder, a choosing of futures. Some begged for surrender. "Our children," they whispered, "let them live, even if we kneel." Others resisted, hollow-eyed and hoarse. "If we give them the castle, what are we?" A woman who had lost 2 sons said nothing, only held her daughter tighter. The night before the reply, the chapel filled with every remaining soul who could stand. It was not a sermon. It was not a prayer. It was a silence shared, an acknowledgement of all that had passed. The priest lit the last candle in the chapel and placed it beneath the altar. "If this flame dies," he said, "so do we. But if it lives, so does our story." At dawn, the Lord gave his answer. He stood at the highest parapet, flanked by the captain and the steward. His voice was hoarse but clear. "We are not a flag. We are not a wall. We are the memory of those who held it. We are the last breath of those who fed it. We are not your conquest. We are your mirror. If you wish to take this place, come, but know what it cost." The banner was not lowered. The gates remained shut. That evening, the enemy responded. A rider approached the outer gate, slowly, solemnly. He bore no torch, no weapon, only a satchel. He placed it gently in the center of the road and turned back without a word. When the bag was retrieved, it held no bomb, no disease, only a scroll. The scroll bore no threats, only the revised terms. 3 days, surrender the keep. The Lord and his house will be exiled. The rest may remain. If you refuse, there will be no second offer. The ram will return. The people gathered in the courtyard, faces pale and thin, listening as the steward read the words aloud. This was the final bargain. It would not come again. Debate was no longer debate, was grief. Some pleaded for the Lord to go. "Let them exile you. We will build again." Others begged him to stay. "Let us die with dignity. No gate will save us now." The captain unsheathed his sword and laid it at the Lord's feet. "I follow your command, but not beyond this wall." The Lord stood alone beneath the broken tower and wept not loudly, not for show, but with the quiet of a man who had given everything and been asked for more. Then he spoke. "We built this place not to keep out death, but to house life. I will not open the gates. I will not leave it behind." And so the bargain was refused. The scroll was returned to the enemy, tied to the same satchel. Inside it, no repli, only a single coin engraved with the castle's sigil. A final answer. We do not sell what was never for sale. On the morning of the fourth day, the ram rolled forward again. The chant began at sunrise, and the castle, blackened but unbowed, prepared to pay the full price. The siege ended not with a charge, but with a collapse. There was no final battle, no last heroic defense upon the walls. The castle held as long as it could, but stone like flesh does not endure forever. On the morning of the 112th day, the enemy ram broke through. The great gates, already splintered and trembling, exploded inward in a cloud of wood and dust, and with them came silence. Not the roar of warriors storming the keep, not the clamor of swords, just silence, thick and cold. The defenders had made their choice. They would not run. They would not surrender. They would sip. The enemy entered cautiously, shields raised, torches lit, but the resistance they expected was gone. The defenders lay scattered through the halls, too weak to stand, too starved to lift arms. Many were already dead. Some had gathered in the chapel for what would be their last vigil, their lips moving in prayer as the smoke of burning oil drifted around them. Others waited in doorways and under staircases, eyes open, too exhausted to care. The captain of the guard was found atop the western wall, seated against the stones, sword laid across his knees. His eyes were closed. He had bled out quietly. The lord of the castle was not found in the keep, nor the hall, nor the tower. It was in the old orchard bare, now just brittle twigs and frozen earth, that the enemy found him, seated on the last bench, his cloak wrapped tight, his hand resting on the trunk of a dead apple tree. He did not speak. He did not rise. When the commander approached and asked for his name, he simply said, "You've taken it." And that was all. There were no executions. The enemy had no need. The siege had done their work. Of the 300 souls who had sheltered behind the castle's walls, fewer than 50 survived. Most could not walk. Many could not speak. They were led outside into a world of wind and ash, blinking like newborns, unsure whether the sky was real. The gates, now open, were left that way. The enemy did not seal the castle behind them. They let it stand hollowed, charred, a monument to stubbornness and sorrow. In the weeks that followed, the survivors drifted. Some were sent to villages beyond the hills. Others vanished. A handful returned to bury the dead. The chapel became their graveyard. The scorched storerooms were swept clean and left bare, save for the blackened etching on the wall. "We are still here." No one dared erase it. A child traced the letters with her finger and whispered the words again and again, like a prayer to something older than gods. The enemy did not stay long. They dismantled their engines, gathered their dead, and moved on. There was no occupation, no flag planted on the keep, no speech. Whatever victory they had sought, it did not look like triumph when it came. Only tired men leaving a broken place. The castle stood, though less as a fortress than a scar. The walls were black with soot. The gates hung crooked. The chapel bell, long since silenced, now lay shattered among the pews. But in the stillness, life crept back. Birds nested in the rafters. Moss crept along the stones. A tree, long dormant, budded at the edge of the orchard. The castle did not heal. It remembered. Years passed. Travelers came, whispering the tale of the siege in half-truths and broken songs. Some claimed the defenders had held off an army 10 times their size. Others said they'd resorted to cannibalism and madness. Few spoke of the truth, the quiet kind, the kind that lives not in swords or fire, but in the choice to endure when all sense says not to. Those who had survived didn't correct them. They had seen what words could not hold. They had lived the long silence. One day, an old man returned, thin, bent, eyes clouded with age. He walked the halls in silence. He found the priest's candle, long extinguished, and left another in its place. He did not light it. He simply set it down and whispered, "This is enough." Then he left, walking into the mist, and the castle remained. A place of ashes and echoes, yes, but also of memory, of refusal, of a final answer, carved not in stone, but in the lives of those who would not open the gate. They had been starved, broken, surrounded, but they had not been erased. The siege had ended, but the castle was not at peace. Its stones bore the memory of screams. Its air still smelled faintly of smoke and decay. There were no triumphant returns, no banners lifted in victory, no cheers from battlements. What remained was quiet, thick, heavy, and strangely sacred. For those who had endured, survival was not celebration. It was a question, whispered again and again. Why? What had been saved? What had it cost? And what did it mean to live on when so many had not? The survivors, few as they were, did not call themselves heroes. There was no pride in what they had done, only necessity. They had not fought for glory or gold, nor even for honor in the end. They had fought because the walls held them, and the people beside them needed one more day. That was the lesson, the thing none of the invaders understood. The siege was not won or lost by strategy or steel, but by moments. One woman feeding her last crust to a stranger, one child singing to himself in the dark, one man holding the gate when his legs had long since failed. That was survival, not power, not defiance, just endurance. The steward, who had once kept careful ledgers of grain and iron, began keeping a different sort of record after the siege, a journal of names, dates, memories, not just of the dead, but of the things they did. Thalia brought candles every night, even when there were none to light. Merrick refused extra food, said the children needed it more. Elora held her daughter as the wall fell. These were not facts for historians. They were seeds of meaning planted in the soil of grief. The priest, now too frail to climb the chapel steps, took to preaching in the courtyard. His voice was softer, his sermons shorter. He spoke not of divine trials or chosen suffering, but of endurance as grace. The world broke around us, he said, but we did not become the breaking. That is our triumph. People came not to worship, but to remember. The chapel was no longer a temple to gods, but a sanctuary for memory. The candle beneath the altar, rekindled by the old man in silence, burned once mortem, but steady. The children changed first. Those who had survived the hunger and the dark now walked with eyes older than their years. They did not speak of the siege unless asked, and even then only in pieces. One boy, who had been found clinging to the arm of his dead brother, began carving faces into stone walls, simple, sorrowful, but strangely peaceful. A girl, once mute from fear, began weaving cloth from the torn banners left behind, her hands remembering patterns no one had taught her. The castle was teaching them still, and they, in turn, were teaching others how to begin again. Some returned to their trades. The smiths repaired the broken gates. The masons cleared the rubble. The remaining guards trained younger men in watch duties, not for war, but for vigilance. Food was grown again tentatively, lovingly. The orchard, long dead, was replanted with seeds saved in secret by a healer who had not survived. Her name was spoken aloud when the first blossom appeared. No feast was held, just a moment of silence. and in that silence, healing began. The enemy was never seen again. No army returned to claim the ruin. No tax was levied. The castle had no more value to outsiders. It was spent. It was wounded. But those within understood. Its worth was never in its walls. It was in the story those walls now told. Travelers came, curious and quiet. They walked the halls and asked their questions, but the survivors gave no lectures. They simply pointed to the stone where a girl had written her name in soot, to the room where 12 had left and none returned, to the charred mark that once held a flame. Here, they would say, we waited. Here, we wept. Here, we lived. And slowly the legend grew not of great battles, but of unyielding hearts. Bards sang of the siege, though their songs were always too loud, too neat. They missed the silences, the pauses, the cost. But that was the way of songs. The truth lived elsewhere in a fortress where people still swept the floors, mended the roof, passed down stories over small fires in narrow rooms. Not because they needed to, because they remembered. Survival had changed them, but it had not taken them. They knew now that walls were never the strongest defense. It was kindness. It was memory. It was the decision made again and again to be human even when humanity felt like a luxury. And so the castle stood, not proud, not whole, but alive.